and gentlemen, it falls to me to moderate this session. My name's Frankie Ward, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you. It would be hard to deny that the greatest challenge our fragile planet faces is the destruction caused by humanity's release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, an existential threat to us all, which is felt most immediately and directly by nations and people that are not primarily responsible. So many people in the earth are on the move, migrating away from failed crops, local conflicts, rising sea levels. All nations face the security destabilization of increasing immigration and war. And so last month, COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, struggled to conclude an agreement on plans for finance to mitigate the effects of climate change and help developing nations transition to a more sustainable energy sources. Rules and a UN registry were agreed to facilitate and record international trading of carbon credits. But such agreements are very hard won in a world where hope is fragile and the forces of denial are strong. The difficulty of finding international political and economic agreement is clear for all to see. So I hope that there will be some continuity with the issues raised in the session after lunch, and please, speakers, with more focus on the ecological crisis or catastrophe, as many are calling it now. I gather our starter at supper is a cheese souffle, so we will stop promptly at 8 o'clock by that clock, 7 o'clock by our watches, so that we can all get to Ridley Hall for our dinner tonight. And so now it is a real pleasure for me to introduce our three speakers, one of whom is missing. But never mind, perhaps he will make his appearance before long. I have warned both of the present speakers that they have only 10 minutes because I do want us to have some time for a bit more participation from you wonderful people. So, I'm still wondering whether Maurice is no. Which will give you both more time, actually, if Lord Glasman doesn't appear. First of all, Richard Beardsworth is Professor of International Politics, Head of the School of Politics and International Studies at the University of Leeds. So welcome, Richard. And Aris Roussinos is a columnist with UnHerd and a former war reporter. So I suggest, Richard, would you like to go first? Yeah? Would that be good?
Can everyone hear me? Great. My thanks to the organisers. It's been a really interesting day, and progressively there's been more and more disagreement. But within that disagreement, it's been very professional and polite. And I think that is a tenor of perhaps what post-liberalism can be. I don't particularly agree with the concept, but it's very interesting to experience it during this day. I want to present a sort of liberal institutionalist narrative in international relations terms that fails. My problem is that within the time of needed action, I don't see an alternative except at local levels, what we call in climate action place-based action, and we've heard of it in different forums today. But localism cannot address the scale of the problem, and the problem is, of course, the climate. I want to start with a set of facts. Facts that, in fact, many within what Maurice calls the MAGA space do not deny, but the leader of the MAGA space absolutely denies, promoted and supported by the lobby of fossil fuels. And that is why, certainly for me, I cannot really speak favorably of Trump or Trumpism. 2023 was the hottest year on record, and 2024 looks like being the hottest record that beats that record over a 6-year period as a whole. I won't go into it now because we don't have time. The global stocktake that was reported during the COP28 in 2023 put the world on track with regard to greenhouse gas emissions, put the world on track for an average global temperature increase between 2.7 degrees and 3.1 degrees by 2100. Now, maybe those figures are to be debated, but the overall trend is clear. And that is with pledges given at the time. Global energy-related CO2 emissions have increased by a further 0.8% since 2023. And the remaining carbon budget, with regard to CO2 emissions only, the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius average global temperature increase by the end of this century, that budget, scientists are modeling, will come to an end by 2032 or 2033, what is called the end of the critical decade, a term that was mediatized a lot during COP26 in Glasgow. Climate science modeling shows that on average 43% cuts are required by 2030. 43%, I've just said it's increased again by 0.8%, are required by 2030. 57%, again the numbers are not particular, but it's the trend, 57% by 2035, so that something like the condition of 1.5 by the end of the century is possible, and that is what we call, whether we like the term or not, net zero by 2050. One effect of the continuing increase is that scientists are warning that we are approaching physical tipping points quicker than expected. Some really important climate and atmospheric science going on in here at the moment. Yeah? And that's where I think universities are critical, by the way, with regard to a previous debate that involved Maurice. Repositories of truth, maybe more in the natural sciences than elsewhere, but it is increasingly important to keep that spectrum of natural science over to the humanities. And that is one place, the university, that perhaps can still do that. So I'm going to need to rush a bit because I'm aware I'm behind time. But if tipping points are emerging quicker than expected, what we actually have is the possibility in the next 20 to 50 years that, for example, I only take one, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, what we call AMOC, will slow down enough for actually Europe to become much colder, and for the Africa and South America, patterns of precipitation to change in such a way that actually the Tropic of Capricorn goes more and more south. The danger of that is immense for migration. I won't talk about the numbers that we're thinking about with regard to the next 20 to 50 years. Under fossil-fueled capitalist modernity, the balance among humans and their animate and inanimate environment has obviously broken down. In 2015, at COP21, the Paris Agreement shifted political climate initiative to the national level, with two pivots changing direction, with two pivots of climate action and ambition. First, what are called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, and secondly, they're periodic every 5 years. This year is the next one, 2025, this coming year. They're periodic ratcheting up. Now, given the lack of directed political will since the 1990s, which has already been talked about, using the levers of the state, this initiative has progressed only incrementally, far behind the time and scale of national and international action that is required. Climate inaction is one fate of global neoliberalism. The geopolitics here, the political fallout from the uneven vaccination of countries during COVID, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the sovereign debt of many countries, particularly in Africa, the rising living costs following the energy crisis, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the fiscal constraints at the moment in the north that were touted constantly during COP29 in Baku. All this has stalled momentum on climate action. And critically, the international relation between sustained mitigation, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and climate finance. At COP29, the finance COP that should have taken place at least 2 years previously, the 100 billion agreed to in 2009 at Copenhagen, which was completed in 2022, was increased to 300 billion. Whereas developing countries, particularly the LDCs and the small island states, were asking, as you will well know, for 1.3 trillion. Again, I'm not particularly concerned about exact numbers. The multilateral system held with an agreement, but the distrust between North and South has increased yet again. And in that distrust, there is no possibility of proactive climate diplomacy and proactive climate leadership. That, at least, would be my contention from a liberal institutional position. Finance is needed both within the richer countries, obviously, we've been talking about that, and given poverty, and between the richer and poorer countries to implement the necessary energy transition and to implement it with something like justice. Just transition. If NDCs, nationally determined contributions, are going to meet the science-based targets of which I spoke at the beginning, the transition from carbon-based fuels to renewable energy must take place at pace. At present, renewables are about 30% of global electricity, but overall, fossil fuels make up still about 80% of overall generation of power in the world. At present, the hope and expectation that finance will arrive is directed towards the private sector. That happened at COP29. But there is no comprehensive plan to schedule the economic transition required at either national or international level. The political will and leadership required are simply not there. And there's a whole question around their sovereignty as well. Just think of what Saudi Arabia and Russia are doing with regard to fossil fuels and the blocking of various kinds of alliances that are going on within international climate diplomacy. So I find sovereignty a difficult concept at the same time, even if I'm arguing for state action. If the international energy transition is left in large part to the private sector, and the investment required suggests that it will have to be in public-private partnerships, it is difficult to see how it can be at the same time a just transition with the co-benefits, to speak in policy terms, of a healthier, more nature-based pattern of life in which values can be rehearsed and experienced. There's clearly a hope there, which a lot of us are very interested in as a final end of a just energy transition. As a result, without political direction, socioeconomic resistance to the energy transition will continue to grow. The perfect storm of accelerating climate realities across the world in all continents, uncoordinated political action nationally and internationally, and an economic transition to renewables without any effective moral steer is one future that we have to address as soon as possible. But it is unlikely. My question to this audience, and particularly to those who spoke earlier today, is this. Are we able to do anything more than address this potential storm with incremental policy steps that fail to achieve either the time or the scale of what is needed to address the crisis. For me, last two comments, anchoring at the national level, to go back to Wolfgang's conversations earlier, will not address the climate realities for the most vulnerable states in the world, and it'll increase the distrust. Perhaps something like, and this is an IR term, an international relations term, yeah, the enlightened self-interest of richer countries being able to help develop more vulnerable countries in their own interest of creating things at a national level elsewhere than their own nation to prevent the kinds of migration flows that will undoubtedly be starting to flow in the next 10 years. Perhaps that's one way of going forward, which links again, in Wolfgang's terms, the state and international order. I'm very unsure, within the terms of climate diplomacy and leadership, that that is at present possible. But what I have not heard yet today, within the terms of post-liberalism, is how this crisis is to be addressed in terms of national sovereignty, and in terms of the way in which the local can be an effective response to the crisis of capitalist modernity. And I think that the climate crisis is a really telling way of addressing some of the weaknesses of the arguments that have been made earlier today. And I say that in due respect of those arguments, which I very much appreciated. But I do believe, and I think it's very interesting the ecological crisis hasn't been confronted head on here. I do believe we need to address it if post-liberalism is going to become a meaningful concept that has political traction in the next 10 to 20 years. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Richard. We're taking our speakers in alphabetical order. So, Maurice, Lord Glasman, you're next.
So, I'm glad I didn't have a drink just now. And, real apologies for appearing twice today. I'm only obeying orders, as they used to say, and I also apologies for being here again, and also wanted to really thank Professor Clark for the talk and for introducing me to a new idea of deconceptualization, which I think is much better than deconstruction, and I would definitely say that Labour, my party, is in an advanced state of deconceptualization. I think that's a really, really very good way of putting it. But I would also say to you that modern ideological forms, particularly in relation to the ideological forms that took place within the era of state formation, nation-state formation, are synthetic in form, drawing upon more local traditions, religious traditions, craft traditions, and so they always took they weren't as generalizable as liberalism, socialism, and conservatism. I think that within the framework of the British nation-state, they took very distinctive national forms too, and are capable of reforming themselves in different in different ways. I completely agree that we should really get rid of left and right. In fact, I think we should get rid of anything that flows from the French Revolution fundamentally. I think that's been an overall humanitarian disaster, but particularly for France. And you can see it now playing out in a real decomposition of their polity and an inability to act effectively. And I also agree with you about race, but I really dissent on the issues of capitalism and class, because I think there is something about capitalism that actually generated the ideologies of which you speak. And I think that conservatism was one form of national ideological reaction to the Corn Laws, to the Professor Clark, the fundamental commodification of the conditions of life. And that was a political response which said that through democracy there were ways in which those consequences could be mediated. And this university is a classic case in point. Decentralized corporate colleges that protected knowledge, the endowment of the chair in maths at Trinity, of Greek, Latin, for the formation also of the King James Bible, institutional forms, the Greenwich Maritime College that developed the cartography and the ship design, the Royal Exchange, which centralized, which made London the pivot of metal trading. In fact, that there was an institutional form built around self-governing corporations that was distinctive of the British polity, and that became distinctive of conservatism. You're completely correct that Margaret Thatcher killed conservatism. That's absolutely right, but that doesn't mean that conservatism as a tradition is dead. And I would also agree with you, it was a long story, sort of almost akin to assisted dying. I don't think Blair was solely responsible. I think that's a long story after 45, but certainly the uncritical embrace of globalization surrendered the capacity of a democratic resistance to commodification. In fact, it was embraced. Now let's get to, Richard, commodification for a second, because this is at the heart of the issue. On the one hand, what does that mean? That means turning human beings into a commodity whose value is determined by fluctuating prices on the market. That was certainly resisted by conservatism and by socialism, Manera, not quite by liberalism. We'll return to that theme. And the other one relates to nature. One of the great things, I was really criticised, with Blue Labour for working with faith communities because they're patriarchal, paternalistic, child-abusing, evil institutions. But I used to say, well, at least they don't think the free market created the world, right? And that's a really good starting point. And obviously the British form, certainly Welsh, Scottish and English form of socialism was deeply Christian in its origin. So, for example, the difference between German social democracy, French socialism and Labour, the Labour tradition, was the enormous participation of Catholic and non-conformist Christians in the formation of Labour ideology. I say these things to you, Professor, because I think you're working with a very linear sense of time, and I believe in the resurrection. So things can return and be reformed and be brought back to life. I really would like to continue that conversation, but certainly the concept of deconceptualization I'm deeply grateful for, and I thank you for that. So, and the problem, Richard, I think, in terms of talking about geopolitics and the international economy in relation to ecology is the consequence of ecology, and I'd like to know Wolfgang's thought for the extraordinary condition of Germany. So Germany is, we know, we thought, an industrial economy, the primary industrial economy of Western Europe, extremely good on civil engineering, production of cars. It was built upon an entire institutional ecology that did in many ways protect from commodification. I go through the particular institutions. There was a co-determination or Mitbestimmung, which had the participation and representation of workers on board, so it wasn't shareholder governed. There was also the extraordinary participation in the labour market through Handwerk, through artisan and the preservation of artisan. I would say, Wolfgang, that it was a unique synthesis of Christian and social democracy after the war, with the rejection of Nazism, led to a notion of decentralized civic institutions with a role in regulating the economy. And it led to an extraordinary creativity and durability of industrial production. And then we enter ecology. For ecological reasons, the German government then abolished fossil fuels as part of its national economy, right? So that's a very strange thing to do if you think about industry which is based on the generation of heat and the transformation of matter into different forms. That was an extraordinary move. It was then followed by the abolition of nuclear power. And that also is an extraordinary move, because what it means is it threatens the generation of the energy required for industrial production. So what you got was a very dirty deal where Germany became entirely dependent on Russian oil and gas for the development of its industrial capacity, and that's where the invasion of Ukraine becomes seismic, because then it was revealed that Germany was not a sovereign nation state, but very much subordinated to the United States. It had to conform to the prevailing international pressure of sanctions, and plus everything was taken out of their hands with the blowing up of Nord Stream. And what you see now is the decomposition almost of Germany as an industrial economy, and then the consequences of that, the destruction of social democracy, Christian democracy, and the entire form of German society, completely accelerated by unprecedented levels of migration. So that's the political difficulty, is that an environmental agenda has really, well, this is it's like being at home. Yeah, they would. My children certainly would. Oh, I'll take another 30 seconds for the joke. But then again, if we look at the, so the other compounding feature of German, it's not deconceptualization, it's disintegration. The disintegration of its forms is that it signed up to a Hayekian form of the EU that utterly undermined the autonomy of its civic institutions and its capacity to develop in state partnership. And that's the fundamental. So in terms of geopolitics, we are certainly moving towards an era of restoration. So I view the present era, I tentatively share with you that it's an era of restoration. Make America great again, or you could say it's an era of the resurrection. It's the coming back of what liberal progressives consider to be dead. One of those features is national sovereignty. Michael, we unleashed more than we thought in the Brexit referendum, and that idea of restoring the integrity of Parliament, restoring the armed forces, these are the ways, I think, in which society is going. And the other thing is, which I mentioned this morning, is that one of the great fantasies of progressive internationalism was that industrial production doesn't matter, it matters very much, and particularly in relation to what now, with the war in Europe, with weapons production. As a nation, the British nation has showed enormous solidarity with Ukraine, but to make that real, it's going to have to engage in an unprecedented growth of its army and industrialization. And if Will Hutton's still here, we haven't had an industrial policy since 1964, so these are very considerable changes. So in terms of the geopolitics, I just want to correct one thing, Richard. What I'm talking about is there's going to have to also be a restoration of universities as places of pursuit of knowledge and truth. What I'm saying is that they've been overwhelmed, particularly in their social science and arts forms, with a form of progressive uniformity. I think the restoration of Cambridge University as a genuine university would be a good starting point for that. But the future is not what it was. The future is going to be contestation over natural resources. It's going to be nation-state bilateral alliances rather than multilateral alliances. And within that, we're going to put a huge amount of faith in the capacity of science and technology to generate the energy that we need in order to sustain our liberty and democracy. Thank you.
Thank Thank you. I'm actually going to set aside ecology because, unfortunately, I think Europe's botched energy transition and the second Trump administration will remove it as a factor in the politics of the liberal order for the near future. That's an unfortunate thing, but it is a thing. Instead, I'm going to look at the world we do actually live in. 5 years ago, I met many of the attendees here at a post-liberal conclave at Windsor. And then we were certain that the post-liberal world was about to dawn. Today, we already live in it, even if it's not the vision of the common good we may have hoped for. I think taking almost random examples of news in the past few days provides us with useful vignettes of this new order. The very recent and unexpected Hayat Tahrir al-Sham victory in Syria was immediately followed by evidence of state-building efforts on the group's part. Obviously, given the group's past as an outcrop of al-Qaeda, its nascent statecraft has been discussed by analysts in terms of Islamist doctrine and practice, with the assumption the new Syria will be a modernized version of a medieval theocracy. Instead, it seems, at least on the basis of its leader al-Jalani's pronouncements on the governance of the new Syria, that the model being followed is the kind of modernizing, tech-centric, state-capacity autocracy of a Bukele, a Levantine strongman relocated to Central America, or of the younger Gulf monarchs. So, over the long and the bloody course of the Arab Spring, we've moved away from the initial assumptions that there was a binary choice between liberal democracy and autocracy, which liberal democracy was somehow evolutionarily fated to win. Instead, we're getting some new third thing. Even if the new Syria is not an autocracy in the Ba'athist mould, neither will it be a liberal democracy. And I think that's not due to any particular Syrian or Arab or Muslim cultural quirks, but simply because if you're building a new state in 2024, the 20th century liberal democratic model... There we go. The 20th century liberal democratic model, which doesn't... The 20th century liberal democratic model, which doesn't appear to be in great health even in its core territories, is no more attractive than a 20th century Bath model. Perhaps by its very nature, results-driven technocracy is non-liberal, even if it isn't necessarily illiberal. Perhaps the new Syria even offers glimpses of our own society's future. And in fact, on that, I saw on the way here someone commenting that in loyalist areas of Damascus and Aleppo just before Assad's fall, people knew the end was near, apparently, because they could see rubbish on the streets, basic public services weren't functioning. Imagine living in such a society. The 20th century liberal democratic model is going the same way as the great 20th century totalitarianisms it defined itself against. And I think you see this reflected in the popular discourse about post-liberalism, where the assumption made by liberals is that there's a binary choice between liberalism and fascism. Liberals are still trapped in the 20th century, fighting ghosts, even as the world has already moved on. So when you apply this to the international order, then the recent, let's hope, conclusion of the war in Syria is a perfect example of this shift. 5 years ago, the operating assumption was that a stable conclusion to the Syrian war was something within the West, which means America's power to bring. Instead, we're seeing the opposite. Rebel victory is brought by a group the West shuns, which is under American terrorism sanctions for perfectly valid reasons. The West's purported end state in Syria, a rebel victory, was brought about by the West walking away from the problem and conceding strategic defeat. Yet the relatively bloodless form of political transition we've witnessed in the past 2 weeks was also brought by the seeming strategic victors, the supposed resistant axis of Iran, Russia and Hezbollah, making the pragmatic decision to withdraw support from Assad, confident they could maintain their interest in a new order. So for all the moralizing discourse we've suffered on Syria over the past decade, the conflict was internally a multipolar one, with multiple armed groups making pragmatic bargains and shifting alliances, depending on their self-interested needs of the moment. And that internal dynamic has, we can say, now recapitulated itself in terms of the international order, with the pragmatic and so far mutually agreeable deal-making of regional powers presenting, if anything, a hopeful vision of multipolarity in action. What does that mean for us in Britain and for the West? Just on my way here this morning, I saw that Robert Jenrick published a piece in the Telegraph arguing that liberal interventionism is dead, saying explicitly that the experiment in liberal utopianism has proven to be a fantasy. I don't think you'd have seen a senior Conservative politician, in my opinion the next leader of the Tory party, making this case, and certainly not using this terminology, then seen as rather a fringe view within IR discourse 5 years ago. And that he does so is a reflection not just of the manifold and obvious failures of liberal interventionism at the height of American imperial power, but also of the fact that that power has waned, we can assume permanently, unless, like HTS, liberals wage a shock campaign of reconquest from their embattled stronghold. Arguing, as Jenrick does, for Britain's Palmerstonian pursuit of our self-interest abroad is a tentative glimpse of British foreign policy in this new multipolar order. Something that would have sounded daringly transgressive just 5 years ago is now the common sense worldview of a senior Tory writing for the Telegraph readership. That's how rapidly the world has changed. So coming back to us tweedy post-liberal intellectuals assembled in the Cambridge Lecture Theatre, then we need to ask ourselves, is this the world we wanted? Just as we cautioned against liberal triumphalism at its height, perhaps we should be wary of post-liberal triumphalism at its death. In the Syrian example, the interaction between post-liberalism and Islamism is an interesting one, but beyond the bounds of this discussion. The same is probably true of whatever Ukraine emerges from the ruins. But really, the world moved beyond liberalism without our input or guiding hand. It was simply the working out of historical processes we perhaps perceived earlier than most, but were powerless to shape. What then is the role of intellectual post-liberalism in the already existing world order beyond liberalism? What is a post-liberal foreign policy in a non-liberal world? If foreign policy is not to be based on the quasi-Christian teleology and moral codes of liberalism, deluded or not, adhered to or not, does it have a moral core at all, or is it purely amoral realism? If so, is the actually existing post-liberal order a harsher and more threatening place for us than the order wrought by liberalism? Can we even argue, at least in the international realm, that liberal order carved out a safe space for intellectual post-liberalism as a sort of tame opposition, just as Assad's Ba'athist order possessed its own safely neutered and marginal critics? Or is the work of post-liberalism now, ironically, that of preserving some of the genuine gains of the liberal era in a world shaped by the competitive interplay of very different moral codes? Is it the provision of a moral core in a world of naked and amoral self-interest? You see some of these ideas play out in the reactions of an arch-realist like Mearsheimer to Israel's war in Gaza. Even within realism, there lies an irreducible moral core. Defining what that core is and what its guiding principles are is, I suppose, now our task. The world we now live in won't be shaped by liberal dogma, but it also won't be shaped by Catholic social teaching or whatever comforting visions of a pre-liberal past shape our political reveries. There are visions of international order to be drawn from the pre-liberal world, but there are also the horrors that spurred the formulation of liberalism in the first place. Perhaps we can draw here from the great theorist of international relations, E.H. Carr, great perhaps because he placed very little intellectual value in a discipline he more or less invented, instead drawing on history and the classics, on the archetypal pre-liberal understanding of social and international order. As Carr observed, it is an unreal kind of realism which ignores the element of morality in any world order, as an international order cannot be based on power alone, for the simple reason that mankind will, in the long run, always revolt against naked power. The issue at hand is no longer to impose liberalism on other societies by force, but to preserve what is humane about it, in some form, for ourselves. It is fanciful that the Europe that will emerge from the trials ahead will be the world of oppressive liberal hegemony we rail against. Critics of runaway liberalism, including myself, may have cause to dread the hard world whose dawning we have so long proclaimed. Is this then liberal idealism sneaking in through the back door? Insofar as Carr's conception of the basis of international morality seems to echo liberalism, it is through liberalism's own self-obscured Christian inheritance. In essence, our task as post-liberals is to rescue what liberalism best preserved of this, as Carr put it, to ascertain what can be saved from the ruins. Perhaps here again, morality cloaks self-interest. Now that the West is weak, we throw ourselves back onto the better angels of human nature. For if the idealist fallacy is that things are other than they are, the realist fallacy is that things cannot be so. By not replicating the errors of liberals in turn, post-liberals may still navigate a path out of the jungle of amoral realism. As Carr observes, political science is the science not only of what is, but of what ought to be. One need not be a liberal in the international sphere to retain and defend a vision of the common good. Thank you.
Thank you, Aris, and thank you all three for very thought-provoking contributions. We've got barely quarter of an hour for, well, first of all, are there any comments that either of you would like to make to each other on the panel? Anything that, should we open it out?
I've got one.
Yes, go on, Maurice.
You rejected Catholic social thought, but you seem to like Christianity. that Aris drew on Christianity for his moral vision, but seemed to reject Catholic social thought, and I wondered what that was all about.
I'm not rejecting Catholic social thought. I'm a practicing Catholic, but I also don't think in the real world, I don't think that's to be the guiding vision of the world we've moved into. I'd say back to Maurice, actually. I think one of the things that Maurice finds interesting about Syria, and I find interesting about Syria, and this is actually relevant to the broader thing, is that it functions as, or it has functioned as, a kind of test laboratory for state building and statecraft. In this kind of hyper-competitive environment, we've seen lots of petri dishes of how states are created and how states fail, and I think that's interesting, bringing that kind of that dynamic or analysis into our own, I have to say, failing state.
Thank you both. So can we, yes, open it up to the floor? Yes. Question there, then you. Yes, you first, and then you, please.
Okay, thank
Cool.
you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Three very, very radically different contributions. And I want to speak in support of Richard, who I think hasn't had the full attention that he deserves. Forgive me, Maurice. We're talking about a potential catastrophe that's approaching. This is the underlying message of Richard's well-informed analysis of what is going on in the COP processes. And I find it, frankly, I speak myself as I ran a research centre at Lancaster on the environmental politics, and I'm a former chairman of Greenpeace, so that's my background. You know where I'm coming from?
Not really.
Okay.
If we can have your question.
But if what Richard is describing is real, and it is, why hasn't it been reflected in the analyses of all these very well-informed other speakers that we've had today?
Thank you.
I'm astounded. And Maurice, I'm astounded at your response to him, to Richard, which is entirely in terms of the difficulties of politics, which are very, very, very great. And that is part of the climate crisis. But you don't address the fact that we're facing an existential reality here.
Yeah.
No.
Thank you.
I'll stop.
Yes, please. That's wonderful. You've made your point. If you could just pass the microphone that way.
Thank you. One of the things I find myself doing this day, as I hear all these ideas, sort of amazing ideas, whizzing around, and that is, what would I want to hold on to from where I've come from and where all of us have come from, the whole world of liberal democracy, which, you know, I'm glad I lived in that system rather than any other, looking around the planet. But what I would want to hold on to is the power of conscience. And by that I mean the willingness to entertain awkward and challenging questions, and the determination to act, not just to sit there and fret, but to come to some kind of decision and doing something in the possibility you might be mistaken, but it's better than doing nothing.
Thank you. Question about conscience there. There's a question down here, please, Alison. Yep. Thank you.
So I would like to dispute the idea that climate science is settled and that where there's an inevitable difficulty that we're facing, and that is an existential difficulty. I don't think that science is settled. It's not. To the extent that it's an experimental science, it can only talk about what has happened in the past. I don't think there can be very accurate prognoses about what happens in the future, and particularly the climate models. If you look into the details of those climate models, because they're so dependent on lots of assumptions that the scientists have had to make, I just don't think that there's that level of predictability. In addition, I think that there's a fundamental opposition between the kind of the exigencies of the, I guess, the climate. I would say it's a kind of a climate science consensus that's very similar to other areas of the university, like in the humanities. But there's an opposition between that and the fundamental needs of developing countries for energy and cheap energy in order to maintain and improve their standards of living. So I do think that needs to be put up to discussion and not excluded from discussion.
Thank you. One question at the back there, then we'll allow our panelists to respond.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Aris very much, speaking from Central Europe, because we get quite uneasy when we hear hard-boiled realists saying, might makes right. We're too small to agree on that. So it's not a realist message to get us on board. Yours is a well-reasoned, and for that reason also a realist message for forming those kinds of coalitions, unlike the multipolar kind of Russia, Germany, gas kind of deal that Maurice so aptly described. Thank you.
Thank you. So if we turn to Richard, would you like to respond in any way to those 4 points that have been made?
Can people hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not going to. I think I'm going to respond probably to David first, and then I want to pass on, because I think what's really important in this forum is that we hear different ways of looking at what is the real for us, and I appreciate the workshop for that reason. David, I'd have thought that, from my understanding, and we can continue to discuss this probably elsewhere, from my understanding at least, the IPCC reports of the 4th, 5th and 6th report, from my understanding and from my reading of them, most of the predictions, I wouldn't say all by any means, but most of the predictions have been borne out through the last 10 years. And the first attempts, which were really in the late 1990s and then in what we've called the noughties, to look at when the carbon budget would actually get to a point where obviously we weren't talking about 1.5 or 2 until much later on at the Paris Agreement, but already within the earlier reports those numbers were already there in some form. The carbon budget and when it would actually decrease to a minimum possibility of avoiding tipping points, that carbon budget has again been understood, I think, fairly accurately, that it was considered as being between 2030 and 2040. So I'm not saying that you're wrong, because I understand that climate modeling is based on a series of assumptions, and those assumptions have to be constantly re-rehearsed. Yeah? But the modeling that has been done within the reports that actually are informing government action and inaction have been fairly accurate to this point. And I will just simply take a pragmatic view there. If they've been fairly accurate, then I will work with them. So that would be my response to their predictability in your terms. On the question of developing countries having an access to cheap forms of energy, of course. All I'm saying is, within mitigation strategies, at a level where greater trust can take place, it can't simply be the historical responsibility of the polluting countries to deal with all mitigation. Yeah? Because India and China are crucial within the ability to address mitigation in the next 10 years. There has to be trust brokered in such a way that actually finance comes in, international financial investment comes in, so that it does become cheaper to look to renewables than the fossil fuels. And for the moment, you're quite right. Yeah? Most African countries will turn to gas at the moment. It's very straightforward. What I'm saying is, if we want to change that, then actually the kinds of conversations that have been going on for the last 3 years, and that are accelerating under the Bridgetown Initiative, put in place by Mia Mottley, Macron and others, which is looking to change the IMF, concessionary rates and special drawing reserve rights. All that level of international financial architecture, and I'm a liberal institutionalist in this sense, that needs to change. And there are very clear solutions out there for it to change, and it needs the leadership to do that, which is why I'm very glad that there was a change of director of the World Bank, who now works with multi-development banks, to actually bring the money more directly to ownership at the national level in more vulnerable countries. So I think there's a very long discussion to be had about cheaper access. And for me, and I don't think we'd necessarily disagree there, international finance is critical. But at the same time, of course, it's a real danger. It's a real danger because the leverage is with private finance. And that partnership has to be brokered, and I don't think we've achieved that in any form to date. So those would be two responses to you. I could say more, but I think I'm going to hold.
Why don't you carry on, and then we'll pass on, and then that will be it then. So this is like a final statement, because we've got another 7 minutes.
Frankly, I think I'll hold.
All right,
I'll hold it.
Maurice, would you like to respond, please?
I don't know if I'd like to, but I feel that I have to. Just to say, I completely accept what you say. I do have an aversion to a certain kind of green politics, which is moralistic, apocalyptic, and hectoring. I naturally find myself. I'm the same with leftists. Oh, at the end, there's a catastrophism that I kick against, and then you've always got to ask who pays the price. And the example I gave is the German working class have paid the price for what's going on.
Because China stole the solar industry.
So China hasn't just stolen this. I mean, that goes to the geopolitics. Is that China is simultaneously the greatest producer of solar panels and the greatest consumer of fossil fuels, with no diminishment in sight. This is the reality of the geopolitical position. And if we do not have the capacity to resurrect and renew our industrial production, we will be in very serious danger of becoming a colony, of being subordinated to China and having our liberty and our democracy destroyed. So what I'm saying is that the politics of the apocalypse is to be resisted because it puts certain class interests, particularly progressive ones, in the dominant position without having to go through a democratic contest. What's happening in the democratic contest is a lot of this stuff is being rejected. Now, I support the green agenda. This is the whole thing is, I don't think that nature, I said it earlier, nature is not a commodity to be exploited. It's to be nurtured and it's to be treasured. That politics is the way I think. I mean, Matthias, I've been to your conferences, also working with Scott Langdon, to go into places of the highest environmental skepticism and find ways that make sense of preserving the sacred inheritance that we've been given. But I don't think that way is by the constant threat of apocalypse.
So, John, can I just ask Aris to respond, and because we do need to finish in 4 minutes.
Sure.
So, Aris, and then come in for the final comment.
Sorry, on the climate question.
Yes, you go. It's yours.
I will say there's a great book called Climate Leviathan by Jeff Mann and Joel Wainwright, which it basically makes the case that the ultimate horizon of climate politics and of liberalism is of global governance. However, we do not live in that world. Like, we live in a world of international competition. And, without in any way disputing the severity of the climate crisis or, the urgency with which it needs to be addressed, we do not live in a world where that is realistically going to happen, I think, within a reasonable time frame. So, unfortunately, the nature of international politics is what it is. There is no global hegemon. And I don't see the looming competition between the US and China being a carbon neutral contest.
On that note, I think we shall end. John, are you sure you don't want to make that final comment? John, no? No, okay. So let's thank our three panellists for